Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Jesus College. Welcome to the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College. This event tonight is being led by the Student Art Club, and I have to say, I loved the whole work and context that went into organising this event. The heart of any college is a community, and it's been a joy watching everybody involved in this process, from the wonderful person in charge of the Student Art Club, Fatima Ashani, soon to be Dr. Ashani, and her team of friends who came out to steward and volunteer, Lakshana, Smiley, Sophia and Anna, in the middle of exam season and everything else, a great testament of friendship. And I can't say enough about Paul McKenna, our excellent college carpenter, craftsman, and the maintenance and estates team who are responsible for hanging. And I defy any gallery in England to have as fine a hanging as Paul McKenna and his team have done. So it's magnificent. And we're delighted that the Student Art Club has stepped up in having this event and bringing us a wonderful and special guest tonight. I'm not going to steal Fatima's thunder by naming them, so I will invite her to the podium to kickstart our proceedings. You're very welcome.
So my name is Fatima Ashani and I run Jesus College Art Club. I'm also a final year medical student, which means that for the last 3 years, I've been rotating around different hospitals and specialities around the east of England. Now, as a medical student, there's only one type of doctor they tell you to be scared of: the surgeon. So during my surgery rotation in Papworth, I go in to my first heart surgery, and the shock on my face when the surgeon in charge not only remembers my name, makes me feel like part of the team, but explains the answers to all my questions, no matter how big or small. I remember in the middle of the surgery, everything was silent, and then all of a sudden, the surgeon says, "Did you know Leonardo da Vinci's Da Vinci part of the surname is not actually his surname? It's actually from Da Vinci, from Vinci." And I think it's probably not great that that's the only thing I remember about that surgery. So I'd like to welcome to the stage the surgeon from my first heart surgery, who after the surgery spent a long time chatting to me about not only medicine and what I was interested from an academic point of view, but also my interests and my hobbies from a more human point of view. We realized we had the same passion for art and the same passion for learning, not only just medicine, but just wider interests and a passion for art. So I'd love to welcome to the stage our speaker, Francis Wells.
Thank you, Fatima. You are an excellent student. Well, thank you for coming tonight. I hope I can share my passion for this work with you. In 1977, I had graduated, decided I wanted to be a surgeon, and we had to do an examination then called the primary fellowship. And this was anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, pharmacology to a much higher level than we did when we did our second MB. So I'd spent hours studying Gray's Anatomy. And having passed the exam, I treated myself to a trip to the ballet. I was walking back along Piccadilly, past the Royal Academy, and saw this advert for Leonardo's exhibition of anatomy, the first time it had ever been shown, other than one brief viewing of turned pages in New York, in the Met. And I went in and looked at it, and I thought, blimey, this is much nicer than Gray's Anatomy. And so after that, I started a reading list for 20 years, because if you want to understand this man, you've really got to try to understand the Renaissance properly, which means the geopolitics of Italy at the time and so many other things. It was a wonderful reading list. And in 1992, I plucked up courage and wrote to the Royal Academy, to the Honourable Jane Roberts, who's the keeper of the Queen Pictures, and said, "Do you think this jobbing heart surgeon could come and see your drawings?" And amazingly, she wrote back and said, "Yes." So on my birthday, it was a snowy February morning. I pulled up at Windsor Castle very proudly, went in, and Jane had got all the original drawings out for me of the heart anatomy and left me there all day, which was just wonderful. At the end of the day, she came back and said, well, have you enjoyed yourself? And the answer, of course, yes, I had. Do you want to do anything with it? And I thought she might take a few with me, but no. But I had a plan to write a book, and there's the book at the end of it. But after all, she said, is there anything else you'd like to see while you're here? And I said, well, very naively, what have you got? And she said, we have 40,000 old master drawings, take your pick. I said, well, why didn't you tell me what you think I should see? And she said, well, what about Michelangelo's anatomy? So off comes another big file, out comes the Michelangelo, and we're there for another 2 or 3 hours. And that hopefully will be the subject of my next talk. But anyway, that's how I got interested in it. All sorts of strange things happened to me after that. Martin Kemp, who's the foremost scholar, apart from Carlo Pedretti, who's now dead, sadly, got hold of my name. I ended up winning the Hugh Casson Prize for drawing with Paolo Rego and Frank Auerbach. How did that happen? At the Royal Academy in the summer exhibition through Martin and my interest in all of this. So it's led me in all sorts of different directions. But I hope tonight you'll see why it's of such interest to a heart surgeon. Well, who was he? Was he an artist, scientist, geologist, architect, engineer, anatomist? He was all of these, but most importantly, he was a natural philosopher, and I'll explain what I mean in a few moments. How did he make his living? Well, actually, he was a special events organizer for the Duke of Milan, for the Medici, and so forth. He pulled off all sorts of stunts for them, apart from doing all the interesting work that he did and the architecture. So this is why we refer him to as a Renaissance man. Renaissance, of course, rebirth. At the time, all of the, and we owe a huge amount to the Arabic population because they had preserved the Greco-Roman works of academia from the 2-3 centuries, millennium before Christ, and they had been preserved in Arabic. They were lost to the West. And Ibn al-Sina, one of the great physicians of the Arabic world, was the first to translate Galen and Plato and other things, which brought it back into the sphere of the West. And around that time, they were just rediscovering sculptures in Rome that had been lost after the sack of Rome. And this was the Renaissance. And Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and all these people appear at this very exciting time. Now, I show you this. This is the School of Athens, of course, painted by Raphael. If you haven't seen it, you must go. It's in the Vatican. And I show it to make the point that Leonardo was famous in his own time. This was painted in about 1511, 1512. And Leonardo is the gentleman next to Plato, Aristotle. Plato's carrying Timaeus. And you see the pointing finger upwards. This is respect not necessarily to the deity, but to the importance of man in the cosmos. And I'll come back to this in a minute. In addition to that, you've got Pythagoras, you've got Bramante, all sorts of interesting people. And this is Heraclitus at the bottom here, looking very upset. He was renowned as a Greek philosopher to be very depressed, but actually we think it's a representation of Michelangelo, who was also very depressed and a great scholar and all the rest of it. And if you want to know what Raphael looked like, he is there, self-portrait. They often put self-portraits themselves in there. So this is celebrating academia and the role of academia in life, as it were. A little bit about Leonardo you need to understand a bit. I'm sure many of you know. He was born in 1452 in the Tuscan hill town of Vinci, 3 a.m. We know all this because his grandfather, who was a notary, made a note writing all this down. He was an illegitimate boy and the son of Ser Piero da Vinci, who was a notary himself and became notary to the Medici, and quite a powerful notary. And notaries were more than they are now. We still have notaries. You go and have your passport verified by them and so forth, but they were lawyers as well. And he had this little sojourn one summer with this shepherdess, Caterina, from which Leonardo was born. She lived in Anciano, just up the hill from Vinci. He was baptized on the following day, the Sunday, in the church of Santa Croce, in the presence of 10 witnesses. Now that's interesting too. Here you have an illegitimate child that's being celebrated in this town, which, you know, for centuries, It's terrible to think that illegitimate children were put to death. They were, put behind people, and at various times in history, they are recognised as being just as legitimate as you and I. And in that sense, Leonardo was as well. There's a picture of Vinci. If you go there, you'll be directed up the hill to Anciano, where there's a little shepherd's house, which I'll show you in a moment, where they say Leonardo was brought up, but that's not true. And he actually lived in Vinci, and there's very good documentation of this now, which we don't have time to go into. His mother, Caterina, married this chap Piero del Daco, who was known as a Catabriglia, the brawler. Bit of an interesting character. And she had more children as well. And Leonardo was brought up in this village by his grandfather and his uncle. His uncle, brother of his father, was much younger and very closer to age than Leonardo himself. This is the little house I told you. It's worth going to see. This is the fireplace inside. It actually has the Leonardo's family's crest above the door. And that's not because Leonardo lived there. It's because the next generation, one of the family of his brother, his uncle, bought it, and it stayed in the family for quite a long time. His education was very simple. This is where he did suffer for being immature. So he had no Latin, no Greek. He struggled all his life to try and master Latin and Greek and never did. He probably had basic arithmetic, and he showed a bent for this and engineering. But he was especially gifted, of course, as an artist and as a musician. He was apparently a beautiful player of the lyre and had a wonderful singing voice, and was also purported to be a very handsome young man. His father arranged for him to go into Florence to work with this man, Verrocchio. In Florence at the time, there were two great studios, Verrocchio's and Palaolo's studio, and Leonardo was apprenticed to Verrocchio through his father and his links with the Medici. And I'm not suggesting Fatima comes to live with me, that would be too much, but he as a student went to live with his master, so you can see how much the master appreciated his work. Interestingly, the medics in the audience will know what I mean when I talk about firms, consultant, registrar, SHO, so on and so on. The fellow trainees on the firm with Leonardo were Perugino and Botticelli, so not a bad firm to be on. He actually didn't like Botticelli, and there's a painting with several paintings of the Annunciation that Botticelli painted, and Leonardo said of it that it looks like the angel had been thrown through the window, and he was quite critical. And sadly, Raphael treated Leonardo as a hero, but he didn't really like Raphael either. So all sorts of strange things going on. So I thought I'd just pick apart a little bit what framed his way of thinking. How does someone come up with such a broad CV? Well, I think the illegitimacy helped in that he had a non-classical education, and therefore he writes in his notes, always see with the eyes of a child. Keep your mind open. It's a great message for all students. And then you will see things of importance. Perhaps the lax family environment. He was a bit of a rogue, being brought up by his grandfather and his younger uncle. He grew up in natural surroundings, so he appreciated nature. And I will show you at the end of the talk his comments on climate warming, which will really shock you. He enjoyed music and art. He was a flamboyant dresser, and he seemed to enjoy company and was very popular. He had this desire to analyze everything, and many of you will know Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And if you read through it, I think Leonardo certainly fits into the slow thinking category. He said you have to learn by experience and not jump to conclusions, and he railed at his critics because they seemed to mostly quote from others, and I'll read you some words of his later, not to think about the problems themselves. If I ask any of you in this room, certainly in any specialty, how many of you in the sciences read books that are 50 years old? Nobody. Who's going to read the books we write now in 50 years' time? Nobody. It's important to use your own power of observation and not be afraid to challenge. And one thing I like to say to the students, ask me questions, challenge what I say, and if I can't give you a reason for it, I've got to go away and think about it. It's a really important concept for everybody. So this is what he said. If I indeed have no power to quote from authors as they have, the academics, it is a far bigger and more worthy thing to read by the light of experience, which is the instructress of their masters. They're reading what other people have written. They strut about puffed up and pompous, decked out and adorned not with their own labours, but with those of others, and they will not even allow me my own. So you can also see there were tensions. When he went into the courts in Milan and Florence and Venice and all these places, there were clearly tensions from the people who perceived themselves to be true academics, and who's this upstart artist, in our court telling us what to do. For Leonardo, the greatest function of the human soul was to understand the wonders of the natural world, and he says this himself again. And anyway, it was much more interesting than to indulge in purely abstract philosophy. He thought of the Florentine philosophers of the day, the Neoplatonists, that they retreated into themselves, producing ideas and theories that could not be tested and are vague, uncertain, and shifting. He denounced this position vigorously. He said their knowledge began and ended in the mind, and as such could never be tested. But later I'll show you one of his thought experiments, so he wasn't immune to that. He said, these are his words again, when you put together the science of the motion of the water, remember to include in each proposition its application. In other words, if you're going to go off and do a piece of research, before you start, think of what its application could be. Doing research to get a paper, to get a job, doesn't do anybody any good. It consumes a lot of money, but actually doesn't take anybody further forward. He said its application and use in order that these sciences may not be useless. This is very forward thinking. Science wasn't even defined as a subject then. And here he's talking about how you should approach scientific investigation and scientific rigor. Now, he was widely read. He had a big library, and we've got his library. He wrote out a list of it. He knew Alberti in the latter part of his life. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that the anatomy I'm going to show you later on was not simply artist's anatomy. It was anatomy to understand. But he wasn't the only person. Alberti wrote, identify the bones of an animal, add the muscles, then clothe it with flesh. So understand the way the whole mechanism works. And he said it more anatomically or artistically, it's necessary for an artist to be a good anatomist so that he can design the naked parts of the human frame and to know the sinews, bones, nerves, and muscles. And isn't it a shame that in modern art schools they don't teach anatomy anymore? Slade is going back to it, but most don't. It's a great shame. And just to show you, these are notebooks of Alberti, and they're quite similar to some of Leonardo's notebooks. So again, people like to refer to Leonardo as this man from outer space, this, incredible genius. Where does he come from? Actually, he was a man of his own time. He was just very good at what he did, and he also had a superb memory. Now, I mentioned a little bit about religion. There's no evidence that he was particularly religious. In fact, maybe the opposite. But what he did have respect for, more like Buddhism, was man's place in the universe. And these are his words again. He said, if man's construction should appear to you to be of marvelous artifice, remember that it is nothing compared to the soul which inhabits such architecture, and truly, be it what it may, it is a divine thing. So I'm beginning to form in your minds this idea that what led him into his anatomy was man's place in the universe. At that time, and still for many, man was God incarnate. Understand God, you understand man. And that was very much what was being circularized at the time. Now, why am I showing you Ptolemy's Geographica? Well, he knew of Ptolemy's work. He had a copy of this in his library. Beautiful book. If it's in the university library, you must go and have a look at it if you haven't. It's one of the most beautiful things there are. But the point is that, again, this rounded attitude towards life impressed Leonardo. This is one of his maps of the River Arno. And why have I put this drawing next to it? Well, when you look at quite a lot of his work, the way he draws, the way he maps things out, have this kind of almost cartographical classification about them to try and help you understand. I haven't got time to say much about this, but he was working with Machiavelli to move the Arno away from Pisa in the Pisa-Florentine Wars, which was really quite interesting. Shortly after, Machiavelli was arrested by the Medici and suffered the drop. Do you know what the drop is? You have your arms tied behind you, with a rope to your wrists, and you're dropped from about 10 feet all the way onto your arms, and not a very nice thing to happen. So this drawing, which is upstairs as well, has become known as the Great Lady. The next thing I want to impress upon you is Leonardo did summative drawings. When he got to certain points in he perceived understanding, he would do a summative drawing and he would describe it. So although this drawing has a uterus, this uterus is not human. There are features of the fetal circulation. There's an ox heart, and the bifurcation of the aorta here is much more like an ox and a horse than a human. So the next thing to tell you is a lot of his anatomy came from animals rather than man. But the next thing to point out is if you just stop for a moment, withdraw from the anatomy, and look at the draftsmanship, and what you begin to see is the thyroid gland in light silhouette here, so starting to produce 3D drawings, and all sorts of interesting other things going on. He's describing a lot of this here. How do I know this is not human? Well, it's an ox anatomy, and these lateral ligaments of the uterus are there because when the cow is pregnant, the weight of the uterus is hanging down because it's a quadruped and needs these large lateral ligaments to hold it up. And yes, my father's a butcher, and yes, I have dissected it, and yes, I know he's right. He wrote, although human ingenuity makes various inventions corresponding by means of various machines to the same end, it will never discover any invention more beautiful, more appropriate, or more direct than nature, because in her inventions nothing is lacking and nothing is superfluous. So everything is there for a reason. And if you use your eyes and you stop and think, you can understand things much better. Don't just let other people tell you what's going on. So again, you can see these are the writings of someone leaning towards a natural philosophy position rather than just a pure anatomist or whatever. Now, I guess many of you will have heard of Galen, 1st century AD anatomist. He was physician to the gladiators in Rome, and he wrote De Usupatum and other textbooks of anatomy at the time, which actually were still accepted by many physicians into the 17th century. Galen, writing about the heart, described a circulation where the heart contracts, the blood goes to the periphery and comes back. There was no continuous circulation. And the heart was a two-chamber structure in his eyes, and air came directly from the trachea into the left and right atrium and mixed with it, and that then allowed the evil humours to escape from the body. What was the real function of the heart? It was to produce heat through friction. Nobody knew about metabolism. They didn't know where heat came from. It had to come from somewhere, but all the engineers, knew that if you rub something, it gets hot. So the heat must be coming from this thing moving inside the body, and that was the thing. Now, interestingly, everybody accepted this up from then and a long time on, and the gentleman from this town, William Harvey, had difficulty publishing De Motu Cordis because of this. But this is one of these thought experiments. So Leonardo takes a plant seed, and he said, like the roots grow down and the branches grow up, so the veins come into the heart and the arteries leave the heart. And that's what he's writing about here. These are his words. He said, you might think that the plant arises from the roots, but that is not so. The plant arises from the seed. Hence, they originate from the heart. The example shown is of the peach, with the plant arising from the stone. So he's arguing against Galen, which one of the very first people to ever do that, which is quite profound. Now I'm going to jump forwards by 2.5 centuries. This is the great William Hunter, brother of John Hunter, the most famous anatomist in London in the mid-1700s, slightly older than John. And when Leonardo died, he left all his things to his pupil Melzi. And Melzi was a very good artist in his own right, actually, but not very assiduous in the work that he did. And Leonardo asked him to catalogue everything. Well, he didn't do that. He did make some attempt at it, and some of Leonardo's drawings have got Melzi's categorization on it. And when Melzi died, left it to his brother. His brother had no interest. And thank goodness a sculptor from Milano, who was at the time working in Madrid, Pompeo Leone, heard about this and bought them and took them back to Spain. At the end, I'll tell you about Harvey's role in this, because it is quite exciting. It's my Dan Brown book I'm going to write one day. But anyway, we'll get to that later. They are bought by the Duke of Norfolk, and they are brought back. And the Duke of Norfolk was Charles I's emissary. And Charles very carelessly got his head cut off. So the Duke of Norfolk, being a royalist, could not come back to this country. So he was touring around Europe. In fact, he became all sorts of interesting diplomatic roles. And eventually, when Cromwell had been displaced and Charles II came back to the throne, he came back, sold them back. So Charles had given them money to buy them, and then he sold them back to Charles II. There's no mention of them other than Mary, of William and Mary, the Orange people, showing them to someone when she was living in St. James's Palace. And then in 1754, the librarian at St. James's Palace, Richard Dalton, is shuffling through some stuff, and he finds an old medieval case. He opens it, and in it there's some moth-eaten medieval clothes. Underneath it are all the Holbeins. And under the Holbeins are these books that Pompey Leone had bound Leonardo's work into. And these are Hunter's words. And a man would examine and see objects which he was to draw. I am fully persuaded that Leonardo was the best anatomist at that time in the world. We must give the 15th century the credit of Leonardo's anatomical studies, as he was 55 years of age at the close of that century. His age is wrong, but it doesn't matter. And he wants to go on and publish it, and he talks about asking the king, but sadly, Hunter died before he had the opportunity to do so. And this is the origin of these drawings in that text. Now, I'm just digressing a little longer. This is taken from William Hunter's Gravid Uterus. Wonderful book. Again, it's in the library. Students, please go and see it. It's the most beautiful thing. Engraving reached its highest point in the late early 1800s. And this is Leonardo's drawing of the fetus in the womb. And Hunter saw this. Isn't that interesting? Can any students in the room tell me if this is a human placenta or not? Okay, I'll put you out of your argument. It's not. It's actually an ox or a cow's, because the cotyledons here are separate. So here he's amalgamating human and animal anatomy, because he didn't really perceive that there was a particular difference. He was more interested in the general function of it all. Right, this is from the Bodleian in Oxford, and it is around the beginning of the 1400s. Now, I think Fatima will tell you that I would not want to do cardiac surgery based on this anatomy, and I don't think you want me to either. And then in 1482, this appears. This is Leonardo's first drawing of the genitourinary system and the cardiovascular system at that time. It's the earliest known anatomical drawing of him. Now, he clearly has been influenced by Galen. He still recognizes the liver as the center of the circulation, the heart as the two-chambered structure, and so on. But this little note is fascinating. It says, this thing, the heart, looks blooming interesting. I want to come back and dissect this a bit later. In 30 years later he does, and that's going to be the subject of much of the rest of my talk. He definitely wanted to produce a treatise on anatomy, and these are his words. This winter of 1510, I believe I shall complete all this anatomy. Here he writes on the 2nd day of April 1489, the book entitled On the Human Figure. That was the title of it. Put those ambitions to one side and look at this anatomy. Look at the beauty of it. It is as accurate now as it ever could be. It's just so beautifully done. But also, this drawing is small. This is a book of facsimiles of the Windsor drawing. So they are the size that you would see. These drawings are small. How does a man with a little quill pen get such depth into a drawing with such a few strokes of the pen? Really beautiful. And this is even more interesting. This is, again, the skull. So he took a bandsaw, he took the brain out, and all the cranial nerves are here. And he was looking for the sensus communis, the seat of the soul. And he drew all these drop lines, and they happened to cross just about where the pineal gland is. We know a bit more about the pineal gland these days, but we still don't know absolutely, so maybe he was right. We don't know. Now, what was dissection like? He wrote, "In order to obtain an exact and complete knowledge, I've dissected more than 10 human bodies, destroying all the various members and removing even the smallest particles of the flesh which surrounded these veins without causing any effusion of blood other than the imperceptible bleeding of the capillary veins." And any of you in this room who've done dissection know how difficult that is to do. And as one single body did not suffice for a long time, putrefaction, there was no way to preserve the bodies, it was necessary to proceed by stages with so many bodies as would render my knowledge complete. And this I repeated twice over in order to discover it. This was a man on intent on discovering the truth. What did he say about the heart? Well, he wrote, "Admirable instrument invented by the Supreme Master," rather sort of flowery language. But he went on to say, "With what words will you describe this heart so as not to fill a book? The longer you write on the details, the more you will confuse the mind of the auditor. You will always be in need of commentators or be required to return to experience for that translate experiment," which in your case is very brief. He was quite sort of rude as well to the academics, "and gives knowledge of but few things concerning the whole subject of which you desire an entire knowledge." So he was very appreciative of the complexity. And for the cardiologists in the audience, I know there's at least one in here, we still know probably only about 60% of the anatomy and physiology of the heart, especially at the metabolic and microscopic level. He went on, he said, "The heart is not the beginning of life." Interesting. The heart doesn't start to beat till 6 weeks of intrauterine life. Don't think he knew that, but it's an interesting observation. "But it is a vessel made of muscle, vivified and nourished by the artery and vein, as are other muscles." So don't get too excited. It's a lump of muscle. It has a blood supply. And he said, "This moves of itself and doesn't stop unless forever." Point about that, what we now call automaticity. The heart keeps on beating through the sinus node stimulation, and he had observed that. Now again, a little more context. This is from Mundinus's work, Mundina de Liuzzi. He wrote this Anatomia Corporis Humanis in 1316, and this was his interpretation of the heart. A three-chambered structure, actually, really not terribly useful to anybody, and still regarded as being part of the spiritual parts. So when the physicians did dissection in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, they would open the abdomen, take the guts out, because that was the first to go off. Then they'd open the chest, take the spiritual bits out, and then the brain, and that was the order of dissection at the time. A little later, this man, who deserves much more respect than he's been given, Berengario da Carpi, was a wealthy surgeon anatomist in Bologna, and he started to challenge Galenic principles. And he did some extraordinary work as well, and Leonardo knew of his work. Now, the interesting thing about this man was he knew Raphael, he knew Michelangelo, he knew Leonardo, and he collected their drawings. And he took them from wealthy patrons who couldn't afford to pay him for his surgical fees. We won't go any further on that. So here we have drawing. This is Berengario da Carpi's text. This is from the next text, which is here, which is the De Fagro Corporis Humanis by Vesalius. And shot on too far. Let's go back. Get there in a minute. So this is about 1540. So 20 years after Leonardo's death. This is about 20 years before Leonardo's death. The other thing I wanted to show you here, mentioning the fact that Berengario knew of Leonardo's work, if you look at the woman in the birthing chair with her abdomen open and her uterus, do you recognize the uterus I showed you before? I'm sure he saw Leonardo's drawings. There are 3 editions of this book, and in edition 2 and 3, and I've seen them all in the British Library, they disappear. So some of his colleagues have said, "You've got that wrong, it isn't like that." And he probably saw Leonardo's and trusted Leonardo's work. In the winter of 1507, in Santa Maria Nuova, he was sitting on the bed of this old man, the centenarian. Hospitals then and churches were banks, libraries, and hospitals and places of religious worship. They covered many things. And Leonardo's money he kept in this hospital. He banked it there, and many of his books. So when he was in Florence, he'd often go back there. And these are his words. He said, "And this old man, a few hours before his death, told me that he'd passed 100 years and that he was conscious of no failure of body except feebleness. And thus sitting upon the bed in the hospital of Santa Maria Nova at Florence, without any untoward movement or sign, he passed from this life." Being Leonardo, he goes on, "And I made an anatomy, post-mortem, to see the cause of a death so sweet, which I found to proceed from debility through lack of blood and deficiency of the artery which nourishes the heart and the lower members. I found this artery desiccated, shrunken, and withered." This is the first description of still the commonest killer in the Western world, coronary artery disease, coronary atherosclerosis. And it wasn't just a passing thing. He writes pages about it. He goes on to say, "Vessels which in the elderly, through the thickening of their tunics, restrict the transit of the blood, and owing to this lack of nourishment, the aged, failing little by little, destroy their life with a slow death without any fever." And again, in the 19th century, older people who had chronic angina used to call it the old man's friend, because it would slow them down, they'd rest, the pain would go away, and off they would go again. And he went on to say, "And this occurs," and this is his health warning, "through lack of exercise, since the blood isn't warm." So get out there and do your exercise. He went on to ask why the vessels are not tortuous in the child, but are tortuous in the elderly. This is a brachial artery with its divisions into the radial ulna in an old man and a child. And he explored this very thoroughly, and he wrote at length why this was the case and did dissect a child. This is the only drawing of the heart and the only anatomical drawing bar one that was stolen from Windsor and is in the German Museum of the Urogenital System. And this is he had a series of manuscript notes. He used to walk around with notebooks attached to his waist. And when he saw something interesting, he would sit down and draw it. And it's full of engineering drawings and all sorts of things. But on this page is the heart. And if you look carefully, and he describes it here, the heart as a four-chambered structure. He's the first to do that. And he talks about atrial contraction and ventricular relaxation, and atrial relaxation and ventricular contraction, the synchronicity of working of the heart. Again, first time ever described. This is Santo Spirito in Rome. This is the old Renaissance hospital here. The new one is here and still functions, and it's on the boundary of the Vatican. So if you look to the right, that's what you see, St. Peter's, and there's the Belvedere where he lived with the German mirror maker when he was there, and this is the Castle San Angelo behind you. You may know, some of you, he got kicked out of Rome by the Pope, and the reason was the German mirror maker had been brought down by the Pope to make mirrors for the Vatican, and he wasn't doing a very good job of it. So in his spare time, Leonardo went and knocked up some better ones, really upset the German mirror maker, who went to the Pope and said, "Do you know your man's cutting up dead bodies at night in your hospital?" They all fell out and he left. So interesting little side story. Now let's get into some of the cardiac anatomy. Well, these are Leonardo's drawings, and I want you to look initially at this section of the heart here and these sections there. This is a modern textbook of cardiac pathology. Look at the planes of section to show the complex interstices of the heart. Absolutely the same. He knew what he had to do to identify the parts of the heart, which is again itself is extraordinary. Now, some years ago, I mentioned my father was a butcher, and a friend of mine, Martin Goddard, pathologist at Papworth, very good cardiothoracic pathologist, I decided I wanted to repeat all his dissections. If this is upsetting you, I'll move on. Well, it might be, it does some people. And first thing was to get hold of the heart-lung block. And we couldn't use a human one, of course. And I phoned around all the butchers in East Anglia I could, and most of them didn't slaughter their own animals anymore, as we did. And I then found one in the depths of Suffolk, and he said, "Okay, Mr. Wells, if you come along next Friday morning at 6 in the morning, you put the beast down, and you can take the organs, you can have them." And the reason is, in the slaughterhouse, the big slaughterhouses, they take a knife and they cut the heart to look for heartworm. So the hearts are all partly destroyed before you can do it. I did that, rushed back, we did the dissections, and you will see the result. Now, this is another summative drawing of Leonardo's, about 1512. And here is the heart itself. I think my battery's gone. You can see on the left, with the pulmonary artery, the right-hand one's been cut off, and on the left it's there. We know it's an ox heart, because there is an ox heart. And you can see it's absolutely spot on in its accuracy. The coronary arteries in the heart are specific, and this is Leonardo's beautiful drawing. Stephen, I'm sure you could do an angioplasty using that. And look at Leonardo's drawing compared to the real thing. The other thing is that when you take a heart that's relatively solid, the fat turns to crumbly lard, and all the cooks in the audience will know this. So actually dissecting them is not that easy. And to get to this level of a dissection takes a fair bit of skill. And there's all sorts of things that we use as cardiac surgeons, the relationship of one of the arteries to the left atrial appendage and so forth. You can see, but why does he want to know that? Why does he want to go to that level of detail? His description of the arrangement of the coronary arteries at the apex of the heart is something that he just does. And these beautiful drawings of the mitral valve are really accurate in the sense, and don't forget these are ox hearts again, they're not human, but they're absolutely right in terms of the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles, and the leaflets, the relationship of the aortic to the mitral valve, and so on. It's all in there. Now, this drawing intrigued me, and it's upstairs for you to see, along with the dissection I did. If you look at this drawing in particular, this is the left ventricle cut across, the septum, the free wall, papillary muscles, and these look like chordae tendineae going across the cavity of the ventricle. But they don't do that. I thought, I've caught him out. He's made a mistake. So I took a heart, and I cut it in exactly the same plane as he did, and blow me down, what do I see? I thought, what on earth's that? So I invoked my friend, Prof. Robert Anderson, who's probably the foremost pediatric congenital cardiologist, anatomist in the world today, and we did a whole series of work. And they're actually nerve fibers crossing the ventricle. And he has found them in human hearts too. So I don't for a moment think he knew what they were, but this tells you he's drawing what he sees. At this point, the hairs were standing up on the back of my neck, because it's like he's in the room with you. And I put it to you, it's the only work he did that you can reproduce now and see the same as he did and check what he did and check his accuracy. Quite phenomenal. And there's another section, you can see exactly the same, the crenations of the right ventricle and left ventricle, exactly as you see in the real thing. So to test it all, who did potato prints as a child? Anybody? We all did, didn't we? So you cut the potato, stick it in the ink, and so this is a potato print of an ox heart. So having sectioned it, I placed it on a piece of paper, and I put it against Leonardo's drawing. It's perfect. So I rest my case, my lad. These are the chordae of the mitral valve, the real thing, Leonardo's drawings. And this is an extraordinary drawing. Nobody's ever commented on this before, not Kenneth Clark, not any of them, Kenneth Keel, because it's such an unusual thing. And to get this image, we photographed it under ultraviolet light. What this is, the mitral valve has 3 separate supporting cords, like parachute cords. We call them primary, secondary, and tertiary. The tertiary cord supports the left ventricle throughout the cardiac cycle. It's an important thing supporting left ventricular function. And here, he's dissected it down to the tertiary cord. And this is my dissection. The leaflet's cut away, there's the base of the cord, and there's the secondary cord cut away just as he has done. So what is a Renaissance artist, engineer, asking questions about the mitral valve to that level of detail? But this one beats the lot. Doesn't look anything. It's an engineering drawing, pulley, ropes, and weights. So the mitral valve, I don't want to get too far into cardiology, but the mitral valve is not just a valve that controls the flow of blood. It also supports the ventricle. And if you cut the whole valve out, the head ventricle becomes globular, more about that in a moment, and the heart fails. So he described this system. So for that reed leaflet, for that reed cord, papillary muscle and ventricular wall, he describes how the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve work like ropes and pulleys supporting the whole ventricular mass. I mean, 15, 12? Come on, this is ridiculous. I mean, it's incredible. Now, when we repair these valves, the heart valves, the 2 mitral and tricuspid valves, they don't close like that. They don't close like leaves of a door, although that's where the word valve comes from, valva, leaf of a door. They close like that. with what we call a coaptation. And there's a height there of about 0.8 of a centimetre. Well, he knew that, and here he's drawn it out, and it's marked it out A, B, C, D, and he talks about it about a centimetre in height. So he's worked out the importance of coaptation in these valves and the way they close. These are just more of these wonderful drawings. This is the only drawing of a human heart. And you see the paper's different. When you get into these subjects, you begin to understand that the archaeology of paper is very important. The blue paper is Milano, the cream paper is Rome. So when he was in Rome, he was obviously dissecting human hearts, and I will hopefully show you why. Here is a real human heart, with the permission of the patient, who's no longer with us. And there is his drawing, and you can see exactly he's got it absolutely right. The ox heart is different, and I'll show you why in a moment, the right ventricle. So let's pause there, and let's review all the new discoveries that he made. The bronchial arteries, more of it in a moment. The moderator band, sinus of Valsalva, demonstrates the heart's a four-chamber organ, atria contracting separately from the ventricles, and a thing called cardiac twist. We'll come back to that. And he described the first congenital heart lesion, the atrial septal defect. Any one of these, when they weren't known, would have made the work for quite a nice PhD study. And he's just gone through the whole lot. So I mentioned the moderator band. Now, this is his drawing. This is the interstices of the right ventricle, looking from the apex up to the base, and here is the closed mitral valve, here is the band. Now, when you cut a heart out and you put it on a desk, it does that. It isn't like that. It just folds up. So how do you do this? Because it looks like it's a working heart. The answer is, and he describes it, he got hot wax, he injected it into the ventricle so the heart was in its working state. He waited for the wax to solidify, opened the heart, removed the wax, and Bob's your uncle, the heart in rigor mortis, is as it was when it was filled and working. So I thought, right, I'm going to do the same thing. So I got a heart, filled it with hot wax, opened it up, and there is my contribution, photograph, moderator band, tricuspid valve. So his experimental technique also works and is verifiable. He did it with the brain too. He injected wax into the ventricles of the brain, and his drawings of the ventricles, which are in there, are the first accurate drawings of the ventricles of the brain ever. This drawing looks a bit like a series of Christmas trees, doesn't it? Papillary muscle, chordae, leaflets. What he describes here is how can he teach the structure of these valves? He said, well, I will draw them on paper, cut them out, and I can demonstrate how they work. There is a real one that I've cut out at the top, and you can see how exactly right he is, even to the, sorry, coming back a bit, going too fast, the moderator band divided here and here. So there's a lot going on in these drawings. It's not like going to a David Hockney exhibition, oh, pretty picture. These are serious works of scientific investigation. Now, we've talked about structural work. Let's talk about function, form to function. Very, very important. You heard me mention a thing called the sinuses of Valsalva. These are the bulges at the base of the ascending aorta. This is Valsalva's contribution. It's actually in a tract on the ear, tractus on the ear by Morgani. This is all there is. There's no written text. There's just this beautiful engraving, and we carry on calling it the sinus of Valsalva. Sorry, it hasn't, something's gone wrong with my text. Going back to the slow thinking part, he said that you've got to do experiments before you can proceed to make deductions. And if you could read that, I'm sorry they've all blurred. My dyslexia is not helping, but that's what he's saying. You've got to actually do the experiment, and here, do it 2 or 3 times. So aren't you all tired of one paper appearing in a scientific journal, and everybody says that's the answer? 3 months later, they prove it's wrong. I remember when I came out of Charing Cross as a medical student, in the Strand, the London Evening News, billboard headline, cure for rheumatoid arthritis. Well, that went well, didn't it? So what he's saying is you've got to really study and think and repeat the experiments. He said, when you put together the science of the motion of the water, remember to include in each proposition its application and use. In other words, if you don't, it's useless work. Now, this is an interesting diagram. He did watercolours. This is one of his watercolours. he was working with the Borgias, yes, those Borgias, you've all seen the movie, with Machiavelli. And on one of the estates of Cesar Borgia, the bank of this river was being eroded away, and he was asked to solve the problem. And so he put blue dye in the river, and he watched what happened. And see this vortex forming here. And obviously the vortex that would be here is eroding the bank. So he came up with what is still the first law of hydrodynamics. When a fluid goes from a large space to another large space to a small opening, it always forms vortices. Aircraft engineers use it, water engineers use it, and here he is demonstrating. So what he did was, he moved the opening upstream there, solved the problem. What's the relevance of that, you say? Well, he looked at the ox heart, and he thought, how does this aortic valve, close? I'm not going to embarrass my cardiology friends here, but most cardiologists will tell you the ventricle contracts, the valve opens, the blood goes out, the heart stops contracting, the blood flows back, the valve closes. But that's not how it happens. What happens in late systole, the end of the emptying phase, these vortices form in the sinus of the Valsalva. And there are several things that predict this has to happen. One, the law I've just told you. The second is this diameter is 10% smaller than this diameter, and the shape of which have, through biological evolution, have formed. So what he's saying is that the flow of the blood forming these vortices actually are what start the valve leaflets moving together, and then the reflux of the blood closes them. Who plays poo sticks as a child? Who played poo sticks? You know what I mean? How do you win at poo sticks? You stand in the middle of the bridge. If you stand in the middle of the bridge, the stick will go down the river. If you stand in the edge, it goes on to because of the vortices. But the other thing is, if you stand on the bank of the River Cam, or even more the River Thames, can you actually, on a quiet day, can you see the water flowing? It's very difficult, isn't it? You know it's flowing, you see something in it. So what he did was, by using various dyes, he dissected out what the engineers now call chords, and they use laser light to do that now. So he was trying to work out how all this blood flowed, and forming these vortices, which you can see here. And he went back to his general hydrodynamics, which he was very good at, and he looked at the flow of water through a tube. And he came up with laminar and non-laminar flow and fluid drag, all very important components of hydrodynamics, and he used that in his understanding of the workings of the aortic valve. And these are his words. He said that when the heart contracts, blood from the lower ventricle rushes with impetus through the cusp of the aortic valve, then forms a vortex that grows against the walls of the sinus and valve leaflets, and follows the concavity of the hemicycle, constantly passing downwards until it percusses against the concavity at the base of the hemicycle, and then by reflected motion turns upwards and continues to revolve upon itself with a circular motion until it expands its impetus. And he writes for pages about this. I won't read all of this to you, but it's basically all saying the same thing. But what he's saying here is, and he did this a lot, okay, what if I'm wrong? What would happen if I'm wrong? And he deduces that if it was just the reflux of the blood, the leaflets would fold up as he's drawn here. And we see this on the operating table. When we cross-clamp the aorta, we give this fluid to stop the heart. It can trip the valve so it can't close. So he was absolutely right in that. But he didn't stop there. He then designed an experiment to prove it. And he writes, make this test in the glass model and move inside it water and panic grass seeds. What does that mean? Well, he made, by lost wax method, a glass model of the aortic root, which he's defining here, and he put it into a continuous circuit through which he could pump water. And he fed into it grass seeds. This is where you have to be very cute. My art historian friend, Martin Kemp, said, well, the grass seeds are too big for that. How many species of grass seed do you think there are in northern Italy? 10,000 plus. So I got my horticultural friend to do some research, and yes, there are grass seeds small enough to show this. So he was able to show this vortex formation in this experimental model. So again, this is modern science that he's doing. But also, he designs the first artificial valve. Again, my friend in the audience will know that this is a mosaic valve in modern terms. And he designed this valve, made it, put it in the model, and tested his experiment. These are modern. This is from a textbook of modern engineering on this law I spoke to you at. This is in a modern textbook of anatomy, and there are Leonardo's drawings, so beautifully explicit. Now, when he was in Milan, he was shacking up with this chap, Pacioli. Pacioli was a mathematician, and this is painted by Piero del Francesco. It is likely that Dürer met Leonardo 2 or 3 times in northern Italy, and if you go to Dürer's drawings on perspective and proportion, they look very much like Leonardo's drawings. But why am I showing you this? Well, it's because the only book that was published in Leonardo's lifetime with any of his work is the Divina Proporzione, and he did all the geometric solids for that book, and these are painted by Piero del Francesco, taken from Leonardo's contribution. He was aware of the importance of what we now call statistics. He said, "He who does not know the supreme certainty of mathematics is wallowing in confusion. No human investigation can be called true science which has not passed through mathematical demonstration." Very modern thinking. Now, in 1966, 2 engineers in Oxford, Bellhouse and Bellhouse, set out to reproduce Leonardo's experiment. They did. They proved its veracity. It's the only paper I've ever seen in Nature with one reference, and that reference is 500 years old. And there it is. You can go and look it up. And this is the mathematical proof. He would have loved it, so I want to go back. There's 6 pages of it, mathematical proof. So, Bellhouse did the work. Sad thing, I don't know if you saw it, about 8 years ago, Bellhouse was killed by a raging cow in a field near Oxford. Great shame to an end of a great mathematician. So I didn't stop there. I thought, well, let's look at a human heart. So I got into the MRI suite, and we had this program. This is some years ago now, before we had capacity at Papworth. And I was working with some radiologists in Switzerland, and we were able to abstract all of the structural components of the heart. And if you look, this darn thing will work, sorry. If you look, I can do it without switching it. You see the root, you can see the vortices forming. So they actually form. I think my laser light is giving up on me. You watch there and there. They're transient, but they're there. So we know that it's right. So then we went on to do some work looking at the rest of the chambers of the heart. And vortices are important throughout the heart. And what we think about, or we don't think about, we think about the heart muscle and how it works. But not many people think about the mass of blood. Blood has mass. So you have interaction between the wall of the heart and the mass of the blood. And if the mass of the blood flow gets deformed, as it does in heart failure, these vortices break down. So there's a whole science of research actually could be done there, which is quite interesting. He didn't stop there. Now, we know when we're putting valves into the aortic root, tissue valves in particular, they can tear away, giving you parapathetic leaks. The leaflets can tear away in some of the older valves. And he appreciated the importance of the elasticity of the aortic root. And we use this in stentless valve technology to this day. He didn't stop there. He then asked the question, why do these valves have 3 leaflets, not 4 and not 2? He said, nature made 3 valves, not 4, because the pellicles which close such valves make greater angles, being 3 in number. So he did the geometry. So with 4, this height is greater than this height in 3, and therefore the forces are greater, and therefore they fail much easier. And this is the first ever drawing of a bicuspid aortic valve, which is a congenital abnormality. Now, I mentioned cardiac twist to you. If I tell you that no heart muscle can contract for more than about 20% of its length, how can you empty your heart by about 80%? And the answer is, if you're swimming and you drop your towel in the water or swimming pool, what do? You wring it out, don't you? Well, the heart wrings itself out. And I won't go into all the physiology, but it's called cardiac twist. And one day, Leonardo is describing here, he's sitting on a hillside in Tuscany at a barbecue. And they're killing the pigs on the hillside, then they're barbecuing them. You and I would be having a nice glass of red wine watching the sunset, I expect, but not Leonardo. He noticed that where they put the spikes in the heart, there's a different moment of rotation. So he quickly dissects them, and he finds the point of equipoise, and he works out cardiac twist. It is one of the hottest topics in heart failure today, understanding that. This is one of the specimens that we dissected. Now, go back to what I've just shown you. If I gave any of you, including myself, this in this room with no textbooks, no one to teach you, nothing to refer to, how on earth do you come up with the detail that I've just shown you, which is so extraordinarily accurate? And one of the last things I want to show you is this, the bronchial circulation. The lung has dual blood supply, bronchial arteries and the pulmonary artery. And when you're trying to dissect out the bronchial arteries, it's not easy in a normal specimen. It's easier in patients with cystic fibrosis if you're doing heart lung transplantation. But here he's representing them arising paired arteries from the back of the aorta, and he describes how they follow the arterial tree. And the other thing to look at is down here. You see this little circle here with a label in it? It's a tubercular cyst. And he describes it being filled with this dust-like material that may be causing disease in the animal. This is an MRI of a human being with the bronchial arteries. Here is his drawing, and this is our dissection. And I show you this level of detail because it will stand it. It's exactly what he was showing. So to wrap up, these are his words about us doctors. He says, "Endeavour to preserve thy health, in which thou wilt succeed the better, the more thou guardest thyself from the physicians. For their mixture is a kind of alchemy on which there are no fewer books than there are remedies." You all know this chap, bit of a climate change denier. Well, these are Leonardo's words. Sorry, it's all gone haywire. But basically he describes how the waters of the earth will evaporate, the greenery will no more be there to grow, and the fields will no longer be decked out with flowers and so forth. And the warming of the earth, the pastures will die, and the fertile, fruitile earth will be forced to end with fire, and its surface will be left burnt to a cinder, and this will be the end of the earth. Well, we're facing that right now, aren't we? And very, very prescient words. So you can't read that either, but his words, "As a day well spent brings happiness, happy sleep, so a life well used brings a happy death." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis, for such a wonderful, wonderful talk. I'd like to open up the room for questions. So our lovely Jesus College Art Club committee members will come over if you put your hands up and then hand you a microphone. So any questions? Yes, the lovely lady over there.
So much. That was so interesting, and also comes on the back of me having been to Bologna last week, where they have the first sort of, European anatomical theatre. Slightly kind of left field, but where did the bodies come from? Because I think that's kind of an interesting...
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, first of all, as you may know, a lot of people think that dissection was illegal in that time. It is not true, it wasn't. What was confusing was a papal bull in 1382 which said you shouldn't cut up bodies. And what he was referring to was at the tail end of the Crusades, when the Christians were killed in the Holy Land, rightly or wrongly, they didn't want to be buried on Muslim territory. So they were being brought back to England and then buried. And the families realized that when they did that, people wanted to come pay their respects and give money, donate money. So they, for two reasons. One, it's easier to transport a body that's cut up in brine, which is what they did. And also, if it was me with an arm over there, head over there, and a leg over there, they can make 3 times as much. And that's what the papal bull is about. Dissection was performed, both as post-mortem. I mean, as you know, at the time, the Galenic idea of phlegm and fire and water, all that sort of thing, they couldn't really do much with it, but they did look to see if they could find a cause of death. Hence Leonardo's description in Hospital San Nuova. But every winter time, there was a public dissection where you could all go to. Now, what's interesting is the preservation anonymity. They were criminals but they couldn't be from any closer than 20 miles away. So you couldn't recognize them. And one year it was a man, and the next year it was a woman. So there were public demonstrations. Now, when I was talking about that little flurry I had in the Royal Academy, I had an artist working with me. I had several artists in residence over the years, Jane Prophet, and I had some American surgeons visiting me while I was operating. And at the end of it, I was waiting for the heart to rewarm, and forceps and blood are great instruments to draw with. Please don't faint. So I'd get a piece of sterile paper, dip the forceps in the blood, and I explained to the surgeons what I was doing. Jane raced over and said, "Oh, we must film this and film this." So we filmed it. We sent it to David Hockney, who loved it. And I had the first installational video in the Royal Academy. But what the point of the story was, I was summoned to the Royal College of Surgeons for doing this, for shocking the public and doing these terrible things. And I was then challenged to a debate from a vascular surgeon in Ipswich who thought it was horrific. So we invited a very large audience into the Royal College of Surgeons, and we made our case. Thankfully, I won. But, you know, views come and go. But, yeah, it's interesting. That there was dissection in varying parts to varying degrees. And, of course, only, 20 years later, Vesalius is doing fantastic dissections and producing De Fabrica, which is here. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. You've described a lot about the flow around the aortic valve. So it was clearly understood that the blood was moving. What was it that was missing and took 100 years for Harvey to describe the circulation?
Good question, thanks for asking it. The capillaries. Nobody had seen capillaries, so they didn't know there could be a continuous circulation. It wasn't until Malpighi in the early 1600s who, as the microscope became available, he did it in lung circulation, demonstrated the capillaries. Harvey never proved the circulation. Harvey postulated it. And what is very interesting is that when Duke of Norfolk was traveling around Europe between the various Charleses, his traveling companion and physician was William Harvey. And he had these drawings in the carriage. Now, if you're an interested, experimentally based physician, and you've got this lot in the back of the carriage, you'd probably take a bit of notice, wouldn't you? Now, if you read De Motu Cordis, and again I would suggest all students please read it, it's part of your education, there were two things that made him conclude there was a continuous circulation of the blood. One was the presence of valves, so the blood couldn't flow backwards, it had to flow forwards. The second was this phrase, he measured the capacity of the ventricle. And let's say it's 80 cc's. He counted the pulse, and he determined what we call the cardiac output, pulse rate of heart rate versus volume. And he wrote, "This is a great volume of blood, where does it all go?" Those words are in Leonardo. So it's very interesting that he never pays respect to it, but I have no doubt that he actually saw it and read it. So that's where the idea came from. And because Galen was so imprinted in people's minds, he couldn't publish De Motu Cordis in Great Britain. I don't know if you know that. He had to publish it in the Low Countries in the Netherlands before he could get it into Britain. And this man, well, put deliberately out here, Richard Lowe, in 1640, this wonderful book called A Treatise of the Heart, was one of his great supporters. And the other great supporter was Descartes. And Descartes, through a mechanistic point of view, said Harvey must be right and wrote in support. But he came under a lot of criticism for it. But I also put this out because this is a beautiful drawing, which in the last 15 years, one or two people we all know in the specialty of cardiac surgery have pronounced that this spiral arrangement of cardiac, it's their discovery. No, it isn't. It's 400 years old. So and there's the proof of that. So that's a little bit of history behind that.
Any more questions?
Thank you. It's absolutely fascinating. And I do remember seeing some of the drawings in the Windsor Library when I was a student here. We had a wonderful trip to look at them. It's fantastic. I was really interested in what you were saying about how Leonardo's drawings and study of water, which he obviously did a lot for the various different kind of locks and so on, then informed his understanding of the blood and the heart. And that seems an incredibly modern idea, that you can take knowledge from one area and apply it in a completely different one. Are there other examples of that, maybe coming from his understanding of munitions, for example, fortifications and such like?
Well, there are, and from a lot of the skeletal drawings and so forth. I mean, he was a great lateral thinker. And, I mean, I suppose, to downplay a little bit, the total gamut of knowledge with the rest was not quite what it is now. So I suppose it was more possible for one man to have such a breadth of knowledge and ideas. But nevertheless, he read widely. He thought about things very, very deeply. But the other thing I haven't brought out, and if you go around the exhibition upstairs, if you look at the drawings, and you really can't miss a trick, his draftsmanship is incredible. And you will see what are known as exploded diagrams. If you look at the one of the ankle in particular, the tibia and the fibula are lifted off the calcaneus with drop lines showing where it articulated. If you look at the cervical spine, the atlas, the axis, it's the same thing. Do you know, nobody did that again until Isambard Kingdom Brunel in 1850. So every aspect of his work, you can see something new and revolutionary that he's doing. That's what is so fascinating about it. It's extraordinary. But yes, there are all sorts of examples of him using, engineering, because he was a good engineer. I mentioned him being a sort of special events organizer. Some of you may read when he went to Amboise with Francis I, he designed this lion that would come on its own steam, on wheels, into the room. The head would open, fireworks would come out, and he used to like doing all these sorts of things as well. So, he was quite an interesting character. And designing clothes, there are clothes designs in there. Nothing escaped him. But of course, what was the downside of all this? He didn't finish anything. He was a great non-finisher, a bit like me, really. So he was, his mind was here and there, and I suppose we call him ADHD these days. But he just, whatever he saw, he got fascinated by, but not in a passing way. He got sucked into it. So, for example, with many of his paintings, like he was commissioned to do this wonderful fresco in the Signoria in Florence, competing with Michelangelo. Michelangelo was the Battle of Cassino. He was doing the Battle of Anghiari. He got so far with it, he never finished it. Vasari, the first great historian of art, whose lives are the great painters and sculptors, then covered the whole wall with these massive, you've been in there, these huge, huge frescoes. And Serracini is a friend of mine in Florence who wants to prove that Leonardo is there. So he's got so far as to drilling a little hole through the fresco and putting a fibre optic scope in, and indeed there is a space between that fresco and the wall. He wants the current Signoria to let him dismantle part of it, but they won't let him do it at the moment anyway. So, he just didn't finish things. The Mona Lisa, he carried around with him all his life. And the Mona Lisa is a great example. It's not an example of art, it's an experiment in painting, using different thickness of glazes and all the rest of it. And note the river, the winding river in the background with the sculpture. By the way, that lady who's just said she's found where that is, you saw the geologist in the newspaper last week, don't believe a word of it. These were all constructs of Leonardo's, and there's all sorts of things like that elsewhere. But yes, it is a fascinating thing. The Salvator Mundi, which was recently sold for 450 million, I don't know if you saw that, that's probably School of Leonardo rather than Leonardo, or he started it but never finished it. So there are only 12 paintings in the world today established that are known to be autographed Leonardos. And that's all.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll do part 2 next time.
So thank you again to Francis for such an enlightening talk and for such a fascinating and special gallery. Other people I'd like to thank, the team at the Intellectual Forum, Molly, Eleanor, Charlotte, Georgia, who've been so wonderful to work with. Paul McKellar, the college carpenter, for putting up all the works so beautifully. The Master of College for pushing arts in college, and to the Jesus College Art Club Committee for volunteering tonight. And again, thank you so much, Francis, without whom today wouldn't have been possible, for not only being a wonderful speaker and artist, and for offering to do the talk, and for loaning the works to the Jesus College Art Club, but also for being a dedicated teacher and friend.